Welcome to the Maison Française. As many of you know, the French historians take much delight in the exercise of ego-histoire, ego-history, and in which they tread their own intellectual trajectory in often, I must say, very egotistical manner, and forgetting for a moment that how much they work owe to other historians and thinkers. Tonight, I am very pleased to welcome 4 Columbia colleagues in an exercise that I'm calling Alter Ego Histoire. Since they all have agreed, graciously agreed, this is better, yes, to show and to speak on the influence of Natalie Zemon Davis' work on their own thinking, their own writing, their own practice as historians. As you all know, Natalie's work originally focused on 16th century France, but has since broadened to include other parts of Europe, North America, North Africa, and the Caribbean, well into the 20th century. But beyond this geographical dispersion and temporal enlargement, one can easily, I think, find continuity in a specific attention to the archives and in an interest in the many ways in which individuals navigate identity formations, be it the identities imposed onto them or those they invent for themselves. The diversity of the trajectories of my colleagues tonight is a testimony to the creativity, influence, and also generosity of Natalie Davis, whose work has let itself been appropriated by scholars from very different shores. Tonight, I will present them very briefly, all of them, in order of apparition on the stage. And after the 4 presentations, I will have a few questions for them before letting Natalie comment on the presentation and ask questions of her own. Our first presenter is Claudio Lomnitz, Campbell Family Professor of Anthropology at Colonial. Claudio received a PhD in anthropology from Stanford in 1987 and has worked since then mostly on Mexico, publishing very important books, among them Deep Mexico, Silent Mexico, An Anthropology of Nationalism, published in 2001, and Death and the Idea of Mexico in 2005, among other books. Claudio is also, in many ways, an intellectuel engagé, regular collaborator to Mexican daily newspapers, and someone who has explored other media with a prize-winning play, which name I'm not going to say in Spanish to not butcher the name of that play, who is co-authored with Alberto Lopez. Second tonight is Elisheva Carlebach, Salo Wittmeyer Baron Professor of Jewish History, Culture and Society at Colonial. Elisheva specializes in the cultural, intellectual, and religious history of the Jews in early modern Europe, including the intersection of Jewish and Christian culture and its effect on notions of tolerance, religious dissent, conversion, messianism, and communal governance. Her books include, in a long list, The Pursuit of Heresy in 1990, Divided Souls, Converts from Judaism in Early Modern Germany, and Palaces of Time, Jewish Calendar and Culture in Early Modern Europe. Third tonight is Matthew Jones, James R. Baker, Associate Professor of Contemporary Civilization at Columbia, Chair of Contemporary Civilization, and Historian of Science, Technology, and Philosophy. He's the author of The Good Life in the Scientific Revolution, Descartes, Pascal, Leibniz, and the Cultivation of Virtue, and is currently finishing another book on the genealogy of frivolity, mathematical formalism, and its fixed constant in the European Enlightenment, while working on a third project on big data and data mining called The Critique of Artificial Reason, 1963-2005. Last but not least, tonight is Natasha Lightfoot, who's an assistant professor in the Department of History. She teaches Caribbean and Atlantic world history on the subjects of slavery and emancipation and Black identities, politics, and cultures. She has received fellowship from the Yale Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery and Emancipation and Resistance, and many other distinctions and fellowship and grants. And her forthcoming book is entitled Troubling Freedom, Antigua in the Aftermath of British Emancipation, and it focuses on Black working class people's material and social struggles and the quotidian practice of freedom. So you see a very varied set of interests, and all of them have been fed and nourished by Professor Davis' work. So.
I'm going to just give 3 brief moments in which Natalie Davis's work connected to mine, and that's all I'm going to do right now. I want to begin by saying something that me to say in order to embarrass our guest, but because it actually is meaningful to the way in which I've connected, I think, with Natalie Davis's work, which is, to me, I feel a little bit like I'm in the presence of a saint. And the reason why I say this, bear with me. I say this because I grew up, though I'm Jewish, I come from a Jewish family, I grew up in a Catholic world, and it was a world that was that gave me this proximity to a rich tradition of recital of lives of saints as examples and as emblems, and I came to understand that these figures and these lives that people know and know how to recite are meant to be examples. They're not always. They also sometimes prefigure what you're doing, and sometimes you discover yourself in them after the fact. So some of the connections that I think that I have with Natalie Davis's work are cases where the work was maybe had a role in generating what I did, but there are other cases where I found myself kind of ex post facto because I read something later and I found myself strangely connected to it, and that's why I'm using this thing rather than to embarrass her. It is true, though, that I do feel a little bit in the presence of the saint because I am really moved by being here finally, to have the occasion to meet you. So in that respect, yes, you should feel, a slight blush. But okay, so the first of my vignettes is the first time I encountered Natalie Davis's work, which was as a graduate student at Stanford University. I arrived at Stanford in 1978. In 1979, I had the good fortune of taking a class that was taught by Ronaldo Rosaldo, who was one of my teachers on history and anthropology. And we read Michel Foucault's Madness and Civilization, Huizinga's Waning of the Middle Ages. All of these books were completely new to me. Even most of those names were completely new to me. Edward Said's Orientalism, E.P. Thompson's Whigs and Hunters, and Natalie Davis's Society and Culture in Early Modern France. Now, those readings, which are of course very different among themselves, but between themselves, nevertheless had a huge kind of collective impact in me, because I had arrived to Stanford from Mexico City, where I trained in anthropology, but that anthropology at that time in Mexico was either, most of the social sciences were either very steeped in a kind of Marxism that in France they called vulgar Marxism. To me, it was just Marxism, I guess. Always having been the vulgarian, what it was, and A.B. Thompson helped that way to me to try to become a more sophisticated Marxist. I don't know whether I actually, but anyway, it was either Marxism of that kind that we had there, which was very teleological and where history really was a progressive history that involved stages and had a strong sense of teleology, or else it was social anthropology and the British social anthropology model, which is something that I admire very much. Both of those currents I admire very much, but neither of them really connected very much with these readings of Natalie Davis in particular. So to me, her work, and then I read some more French history with Wallaby and these other kinds of writers, but it was in some way a new kind of anthropology, but above all, I'd say it was a new kind of history to me. Through those works, I was introduced to a history that, to my mind, had turned its back on teleology and on progress and evolution, and that embraced instead both a kind of radical alterity of the past, that is, I would say, the radical inaccessibility of the past, which is something that I don't think I had understood before reading this. And its equally explosive ability to erupt in the presence, and to interpolate us directly. There was, for me, for the first time, really a deep kinship here between history and anthropology. And the past became a kind of place in which the present is dimly refracted, but also a place from which the present can be sharply illuminated. And in the end, I turned more and more to history in my own work, and the last few books that I've written are historical in the sense that they're archivally based and that they transpire in the past. In fact, next semester I'm going to be teaching a course called History and Anthropology. I don't know what is going to happen or why exactly, but it means that this has been it has left something that I'm still struggling to understand. That was my first moment in the video. The second moment of encounter, I think, was a few years later in Paris. I spent 3 years at Stanford, and then I got a fellowship to go 1 year to Paris. And in that year I was sitting in 3 seminars, which I will name because it will give you a sense of how absolutely confused I was. On the one hand, I was taking Maurice Godelier's seminar, and on the other, Cornelius Castoriadis' seminar, and then finally Philippe Aries's. So I was in that blender. A very odd combination. And it was around that time, I think, that I saw the film, The Return of Martin Guerre. And I have to say, I was awed by the idea, not by the idea, let alone by the fact that primary historical research could be channeled to make something like that, and let alone Depardieu to boot. It was a beautiful film, and with incredible implications for kinship, everyday life, the dynamics of Inquisition, political accusations. The problem with political accusations, of course, is very important to all of my generation, and to the connection, I think, between role and person, with this whole kind of Mosian tradition, which is also, to me, foundational in my attraction to anthropology, which is very present in Natalie Davis's work. I was also drawn by the example because, although I felt, for 2 reasons, but first, I felt instinctively that at that time anthropology was beginning to decline a little bit in its ability to interpolate publics. Even in Mexico, where anthropology had a huge role in kind of official and officious culture, anthropologists were beginning to wane a little bit in their ability to address the public, and I always understood my role as a kind of Latin American intellectual to be one that was going to involve engaging the press, but this book, which I did and I have, and I do, but the Return of Martin Guerre really opened to me just a much bolder set of possibilities, which I didn't act on for years. But then I later wrote a play, and that experience has continued to shape what I'm doing now. So this is an example of something that kind of like stuck a little bit, like a thorn, let's say. To use another sort of saintly kind of metaphor, and that has maybe been, now saying, I'm hearing myself saying this, has maybe been a property of some of Natalie Davis's work to me, that some of it kind of remains, and I go back to it. And then the last moment, so that was my second moment. The last moment has been reading really only very recently the book on Leo Africanus, and here what I find is a history of movement, and the historian as someone who is willing to accompany a person in movement rather than fixing on topic or place and letting people move through the topic or through the place. And this I find very moving, actually. I think that that kind of work actually has a lot of kinship with my most recent book, which is coming out in a couple of months, and which, the title of which is a Natalie Davis title, and I didn't even realize it until writing these notes yesterday, which is The Return of Comrade Ricardo Flores Magón, is the name of my new book. And there it is. So talking about return. But it's a different kind of return than that of Martin Guerre, because it's about a group of Mexican revolutionaries exiled in the United States, but it shares with some of the stuff on Leo Africanus and some of the more recent work of Natalie Davis's, including what she presented last night. That the fact that probably the main historical event of these men's lives, which was, quote, the revolution, is something that they contributed very much to making, but that when it happened, they were very hard put to kind of recognize. They were sort of misrecognizing the process that they had contributed very deeply to shape. More deeply, I think, that there's a connection with what I think one of Natalie Davis's central themes, as far as I'm concerned, is that it's a kind of history of passing. It's a history of passing and of conversion and of conviction. And this return of Gobetweens, he returns as a corpse to Mexico. He dies in Leavenworth prison. But the return does involve a process of purification through narration. That is, he's turned into kind of the epitome of the pure revolutionary, but he's also at the same time made it into an anachronism. That is, he's turned into a precursor of the revolution rather than its contemporary, which he was a contemporary of the revolution. So finally, I'd say that there's a kind of uncanny return in me to Natalie Davis not only as a person who figured the connection between anthropology and history that has occupied my work, that came to occupy my work many years after I took that seminar with Renato, but also because this ethnography of passing and of the kind of cultural productivity that goes along with this personal movement is something that I'm deeply connected to, both in the object of my work, but also as a subject. That is, I can't remember the name of the fellow, the three names of the fellow that she spoke about last night. I just remembered Saada, which I like, because of course Lazarus was. I've forgotten his last name, or even any one of his three last names.
Sénéon was the easiest.
Sénéon. Or Shenyanu. I was interested in because my grandfather came from more or less the same region. He was maybe one generation older, emigrated to Peru, and what would probably tell his story as practically a continuation, a postscript to this history. So I found myself also strangely, personally connected to some of these histories, including Leo Africanus in a strange way.
Although several of Natalie's books have been foundational for my understanding of aspects of the past, think for just a moment about Glickle and your work about putting that woman within the perspective of her 17th century peers and women on the margins, and specifically her essay in Printing and the People. It was the first work I had ever read that looked at popular calendars as a source for cultural history, and that reaped benefits much later. But I've decided to focus my remarks, because that's how I understood our original assignment, on one work of yours that was for me, and still is for me, most important methodologically, and that's Fiction in the Archives. It is a book that I think is still as fresh today as when it first appeared some decades ago. It is a work that I push on all of my graduate students. I don't care what they're working on. There are lessons to be learned from it. It is a book that is, first of all, a love letter to archival research. It is the book that taught me to really listen to the sources as well as simultaneously hearing them against their grain. Natalie attends with such care aspects of stories and the sources that the original creators did not intend. When I first picked up that book, it was an eye-opener. I was either a newly minted PhD or maybe just before. One generally thought of archives as repositories of immovable facts, and fiction as well, part of a different order of writing. Archival research had been, in my eyes until then, the bedrock the core layer, the research level beyond which one could peer no deeper into the past. While literary sources were created by their authors to project certain images and advance certain arguments, I had approached archival sources more naively. For court records, for example, I always assumed somebody had actually spoken those very words under oath. They were recorded by professional scribes. Even confessions produced under torture or the threat of it. Think of the vast inquisitorial holdings. For example, while they couldn't be used to determine innocence or guilt, they could be relied upon as words truly spoken, and one only had to supply the context. This book awakened me to the realization that even the words in the archives are shaped by their narrators to effect certain outcomes, and they can never be approached naively. A second aspect of the book that opened my eyes, and this will relate to what Claudio just told us, was its understanding that marginal, powerless, or peripheral lives were in fact the best conduits for illuminating aspects of a whole society. This might sound trite now, but it was still quite novel when Natalie began to explore 16th century France. She was able to find in the royal archives testimony that allowed us to peer into the lives of people who were usually distant from the corridors of royal politics and influence, and to see how they nevertheless negotiated that distance, not merely in miles, but in sensibility. Schooled to think that Jewish history consisted of the words of rabbis and philosophers, this work helped me get past those texts to explore other worlds. Finally, I want to point out the quiet scholarly heroism that undergirds every statement in that slim but magnificent volume, and I'll just give you one example. Natalie devoted an entire chapter in that book to the remissions requested by women, to the striking gender differences between the way narratives were shaped to pardon women in contrast to those of men, to the role of emotion and its intersection with the legal system divided by gender, to the developing fear of women's sexuality in the 16th century as reflected in the laws, and more. Yet she's careful to remind the reader in the text that this entire discussion of women and gender is based on a tiny percentage of the overall collection of petitions. To give readers a rough idea, she wrote, out of some 4,000 remissions, about 1% were sealed for women. Do you remember that? This is not a number that came out of secondary sources, because in a footnote she writes, out of 4,189 letters in these volumes, I found only 37 receiving remission. 4,189. This quiet thoroughness is typical of the careful scholarship in all Natalie's work, and that's why it stands up to the tests of time, because its foundation is so strong. The historian's instinct and craft comes through when out of that vast mass of material, Natalie is able to pluck the telling details. These grant the narratives their immediacy and persuasive qualities, add texture and vibrancy to the entire enterprise. She demonstrated how every element in each petition, from its starting point to its conclusion, each part of the framing narrative was calculated to create a pardonable tale. Nothing was written randomly. Thus, she mapped out the temporal framing devices for the pardon tales, noting, for example, that while historical events played virtually no role, ritual and festival cycles played a pivotal role in the memories of pardon tellers. She sought clues to the class and position of the teller, particularly any links to the royal household to see whether that made a difference. What were the crimes associated with men and women of the 16th century? Pardon tales were told by people who hoped to be liberated from the judgment of the law. The entire enterprise symbolized the quality of royal mercy and power, life granted by a king who showed himself by means of pardons to be simultaneously at the head of the justice system and above it. These days, or I should say maybe these years, I'm working on the private ledger of a scribe in the Jewish community of 18th century Altona. Virtually every lesson of fiction still resonates for me as I seek to read both sympathetically and against the grain of the stories he tells. So I'll conclude by thanking Natalie for this wonderful book and by mentioning my sole complaint. It is out of print, and it is unavailable to a new generation of students who want to cherish it as their own.
I'll take up Emmanuelle's invitation to be slightly egotistical as it was. So I arrived at Columbia in 2000 under false pretenses. I was in a history department and I had failed to take any history classes as a graduate student. This was a problem. Actually, I had three problems. One, I had no idea what history was. Secondly, I was trying to write a book which simultaneously connected the history of mathematics, which no one wanted to hear about, with the history of elite subjectivity in early modern Europe, which I didn't know how to do. In fact, I'd written a dissertation which I titled The Aesthetics of Inference, which pleased no one besides myself. Thirdly, though I didn't know this at the time, I had lost my copy of this book in a house fire 4 months previously. So how was I going to deal with this? Well, I needed to learn something. I needed to learn something about how to be a historian, and I needed to learn something about how to write about these sorts of things. And I thought, well, I have to teach a seminar Monday at 9 a.m. because I was the new assistant professor, so what slot did I get? And to show you how alienated I was, in fact, from history, I decided, well, I'll teach a class called Subjects and Objects of Renaissance Knowledge. What could be more historical? 6 students arrived, much perplexed by the entire endeavor. And we had a grand time. We read lots of things that I desperately wanted to read. Rabelais, Cervantes, Tempest, but also, centrally, a number of essays of Natalie Zemon Davis. Because my interest was to get the students to understand and to get myself to understand how we might come to know different kinds of people during the Renaissance and the kinds of knowledge that they had. I am a historian of science. My interest was, of course, I was writing a book about Descartes, a classic subject, but I wanted to write it differently. And I wanted to say something about, as I said before, the very technical detail of those mathematics mattered to the kind of subject it was. Well, 2 days before I was to teach 2 essays from this book, I discovered I didn't have it. And so I ran and bought what I think is probably my 4th copy of the book. Now, what turned out to be so amazing, and I found this in my notes at the time, is that these essays, and I'm going to speak about Natalie Zemon Davis as an essayist, especially these early essays, got at fundamental issues that are almost, and to say this is to get into the sort of most boring and arcane way that historians tend to debate, questions of structure and agency. But not just of our historical actors, but of ourselves as historians. Now, as I said, I set myself the task to learn how to be a historian. And what I found in these essays, and particularly these classic essays, The Rights of Violence and Women on Top, that I assigned to my students and we read together, and being wonderful undergraduates, I learned more from them than they from me, I'm sure. And what I found was a deep meditation on questions of structure and agency, in which calmly, dispassionately, with great empirical care, a critique was made of the extant literature. A critique that at once said what was wrong with the studies of communal violence, or of apparent rights of violence, or indeed questions of women on top, was both that historians didn't understand structure, they understood structure wrong, and they didn't understand agency, and that those were intimately connected. they misunderstood simultaneously the way in which these rights were functioned to retain authority and created possibilities of transformation. This is just what I needed, in that I was precisely interested in doing a localized history of science, in which I wanted to understand the very possibilities of change. Now, this is perhaps very well known, and if you've not read these essays recently, I encourage you to do so. I should say now, this book is still in print, but they're also wonderfully available on JSTOR, many. And the essays are formally extraordinarily helpful because they introduce a topic and then they describe interpretive approaches that might be useful. And then they turn on a dime and they say, as she says on page 103, these historical and functional formulations provide us with a framework and some alternatives for interpreting the Addies in this room. They are, however, very general, semicolon. And what follows from the very general is the demand for precisely the research that my colleague Elisheva has just elucidated. And so formally, what is narrated is precisely a generosity in drawing upon interpretive frameworks and a demand for the empirical specificity. This was something that I learned a lot. It was a way precisely of getting at the people we were interested in the past, their structure, their aims, but also a model for me and the young historians I was attempting to train. Because it was a model of how one could draw upon interpretive sources and not be captured by them, to be enabled by them, but not constrained by them, to not be yet another instantiation of a particular theory, but someone greatly enriched by it, someone able to write a thick history, and not thick in the thick descriptions, but thick in kinds of causation, in kinds of approach, in an approach that would serve simultaneously to capture our need for certain kinds of functionalist explanations and our sense of their limitations. Now, in my field, I was not the only one to be affected in this way by Davis. In history of science, in the sort of 80s, there were two poles, and neither of them were appropriate. One was a kind of internalist narrative that saw science as largely about itself and had different developmental stories. The other, equally toxic, was a sociological determinism. These were not adequate, and we needed help. We needed help, and we needed to understand a localism. For many of us in the early modern field, one of those helps was precisely this. Now, it was both a topical help. All of a sudden, we knew that we wanted to talk about jokes and rituals in a different way. But it was also a methodological help, because it showed us the kinds of anthropological theories we might draw upon, but also a deftness in handling them and not being constrained by them. These essays, and I really want to stress this, are formally brilliant in capturing structure and agency, both of the actors and of the historian. Now, some years later, I published my book, sort of having figured it out, and I was successful in that I was denounced both for not doing an adequate amount of social history and not doing enough philosophy, so I had succeeded at some level. And yet, and thankfully I already have tenure, I had never used an archive per se, because I was working on canonical figures, so I said, well, I should learn to do that. And then I became interested in the voices of the people who worked with the philosophers when the philosophers failed. When the philosophers failed to make calculations. And I was in the archive listening to the voices. And the inspiration that I got, again, from Davis, was not to cast my artisans, the artisan Olivier, who worked with Leibniz, who occasionally was thrashed by Leibniz's servant for not making the calculation. What I learned was something about not putting those artisans into a sort of eternal pre-industrial past, but to actually understand not only their activity, but the agency by which they tried to transform themselves on their own terms, to be part of a different enlightenment. The way that they didn't copy someone's survival, but attempted to do something on their own, the way in which they tried to be agents within it. the structure they had offered. Now, Davis was ahead of the curve in many ways for my field, and The Women in the Margins was the second book that I assigned and I assigned the article on Marion, which is a remarkable study. And it's a remarkable study of the conditions under which one would do local study, a sensitivity to the empathies of that. And late in the essay, Natalie Zemon Davis contrasts a kind of overly reductionist account of what European colonialism and its relationship to national knowledge would be, and says that, as true as that is in many cases, it could not capture the very precise local qualities of that which Marion had done. What it teaches us is it wants to be reflexive about the conditions under which we've developed the kind of empathies we have, as well as the toxicities in the approaches we have. It challenges us to step out of those ways in which we get captured by the very structures of interpretation that sometimes constrain our discourse in the very moment that we're enabled by. For all of this, I think.
I just wanted to start by saying that by the time I started graduate school, it was sort of commonplace to be studying ordinary people. Looking at ordinary lives is pretty much what myself and every single other person that was in my cohort at NYU at the time was doing. And so I would say that we stand on your shoulders, very much this generation. The idea that, you know, for Elisheva, it was novel to be looking at ordinary lives, and that your work sort of blazed that trail. It just lets me know that, you know, I was relatively privileged for not having to prove the importance of slaves or peasants or women, you know, in any given time or space. So thank you for that. I also am very much just impressed with the way that you've been so willing to jump around from place to place, time to time, in, you know, in a field where people relatively get in a wheelhouse and stay there, you know, and you know, I think your career choices are very thoughtful and I think prescient given what's going on in our field now, where there's so much spillage between different, you know, different fields of social inquiry and even within history. Lots of broad comparative analyses taking place, so that, you know, being able to just know so much across so many different times and places is, you know, another admirable quality. So I would love to thank you for that scholarly example. So for me, my work is on Atlantic slavery and freedom, and you know, I think now that we've started to dedicate some recent intellectual energy toward it, certainly I think our field is the better for it. The work that Dr. Davis is doing on Dutch colonial Suriname is really impressive in that it pushes us to rethink certain existing well-known documents that many scholars of this period in time sort of are interested in, sort of like John Gabriel Stedman's slave narrative, you know, travel narrative on what's going on in slave society in Suriname. Those kinds of documents are really something that we all know, but have been forced to come to kind of reassess with the other sorts of deep archival work that you've done to flesh it out, and, you know, remind us that there's something specific about Suriname, but at the same time, still something exemplary of the complexities of statecraft, of socializing, of economic production at the far edges of empire, where the majority of people are existing in racially based bondage, that there is something to be said for how those far edges still somehow shift the center of empire and the way that, you know, the Netherlands thought of itself, let's say. I also am very excited about the ways that there's sort of been an ongoing debate in the field of Atlantic slavery and freedom around the story of creolization, the idea that there is a sort of ambiguous space of newness being constructed between the old worlds of Africa and Europe, and what is coming into being in the Americas, particularly questions around the values, the cultural customs, the languages that are being developed in slave societies, the community building practices that are being reshaped to adapt to the horrors of the slave trade, to the encounter with unfamiliar European customs that African slaves are engaging in different ways, and also as well the rigors of plantation labor. Creolization is sort of this ongoing phenomenon that many historians have seen as something that happens to Africans, where Africans are changed in the transition from captivity on the coast of the continent of Africa through the Middle Passage and into seasoning in the Americas. And I think Dr. Davis's work is so important for evidencing concretely that creolization is multi-layered, multi-directional, that as much as Africans are changed by their Europeanization in the Americas, also masters themselves are changed as well. They are Africanized to some extent. They necessarily too had to approach and adjust their lives and labors in the colony based upon how the slaves practiced their own spiritual beliefs, practiced their own forms of labor, and meted their own forms of justice. So ultimately the effect of this encounter between the two cultures doesn't just change the constituent parts, but it also comes together to create something distinctly new, and in this case, distinctly Surinamese along the way. So I want to talk a bit about the 2011 article that she published in the Law and History Review on criminal justice between the 17th and the 19th centuries in Suriname. And I think even though it's again a marked departure from the other works that she has produced in that very large and impressive body of work, it still very much fits within the conversation that her research has built around how multiple cultures and social orders can coexist, however uneasily, and how different sets of people dwelling within them are both shaping them and are shaped by them. From this piece, we learn that slaves had their own system of criminal justice beyond what were the plethora of regulations that the Dutch authorities had established and violently enforced. The work of absolution or punishment within the slave community derived from systems existent within West African societies from which they hailed. And I think the article does such an excellent job of presenting West African cosmologies and customs that undergirded these practices in the Suriname slave community. And we see them as fully fledged systems in their own right that had complex philosophies, right? That prompts us as Western readers to afford them the same kind of respect then that we would European systems of law and meeting justice. And so I think it's important to recognize how she's cluing us in as readers to the ways that slaves rebuilt alternative justice systems in the colonial context, starting with the process by which they came from the continent from different sites. And so they had to come together on ship and sort of create languages that were legible to one another, that they could even be able to converse with one another, understand each other linguistically and culturally, and then as they themselves sort of develop innovative ways to speak to one another, they too also would build unlikely alliances with certain Europeans who are trying to understand them. And so those moments of collaboration then produce actual works of translation, where you see the juxtaposition of Creole languages from Suriname, like Sranan or Saramakan, with German or English or Dutch. And so there's an incredible archive that exists now of linguistic innovation among slaves. And those dictionaries actually allow for some hints that then Dr. Davis really sort of astutely picks up on around the context for the use of certain words that is very much related to the ways that they then actually were formulating ideas about justice. So certain words were very much directly connected to how certain forms of guilt or determining, and certain practices of meeting punishment or absolving, a particular party was actually sort of in the fabric of the language itself. So in the piece, I think she's also doing really great work to draw our attention to people who serve as the go-betweens, that bridge the slave community with the Europeans who were their owners or legal or political authorities. So we see that there's not just an internal hierarchy happening, there's not just a hierarchy happening between African and European, but there's also an internal hierarchy within the slave community. And Europeans are exploiting the existence of this hierarchy, sure, but they also had to respect it and engage with it in certain ways. So that male slave drivers, for instance, or the female cooks or seamstresses who had attained a certain level of respect within their community, the male diviners, the female diviners and healers, they're important to Suriname's enslaved community, and so masters who are trying to access certain kinds of crucial information about what is happening in the slave community had to do so through them. And so these folks are often the ones who are responsible for reporting on what's happening in the community. The different methods and extent of duress involved in proving guilt or determining innocence in moments of wrongdoing is something that they're going to be especially responsible for. And so masters had to respect that role that they played in the community as well. At many moments too, what's interesting about them is that despite the fact that these are trusted slaves, Dr. Zemon Davis's piece also shows us that they too could become the leaders of attempted revolts or flight from the plantation. So the very people who are also the most mobile, the most, have the most savvy and the most access to the master class are also sometimes the people who are going to exploit that position of relative power and actually become the people who lead the resistance against the plantation enterprise. So it's clear that they, that sort of the work is very important for, making us attend to the ways that these people not only insinuated themselves within the European master class that was, at work in Suriname, but they also, in many ways, undermined them too. So I think what's interesting about it, I think that those figures that she's tracing, that are these go-betweens, I think for me that's where you see the work that she's been most known for doing so well in European and Mediterranean history. I think the rare historical actors who manage to sort of permeate what we might presume are strict boundaries between different social strata. So people like Martin Guerre, so people like Leo Africanus, so these slave drivers and these seamstresses and these cooks, right? They're all the exceptions in many ways that allow Dr. Davis to illustrate the rules of ordinary historical lives in very provocative fashion. While racial, gender, or class equality isn't universally possible in the distant or even the recent past, I think her work, as well as her life even, suggests that these moments of rare challenges to inequality in history can bear fruit for even the social change that we could make possible now. And so I want to close by saying as well that I think Dr. Davis is just inspiring because she just tells good stories. I believe that as scholars, we're all here to do the same, right? And I want to thank her for just giving a model of something that's so readable, so accessible, so interesting.
If I may say so, I think Natalie Zemon Davis is also very inspiring, not for the story she tells, but for the questions she asks. She constantly asks questions, and if you look at her work in a kind of at her intellectual trajectory, there are questions that build on each other. And I was watching her in the past 40 minutes, 45 minutes, and I saw lots of notes and lots of energy looking at you and taking notes and asking questions. So I'm going to let her now ask a few questions to you. Let her do that, and then we'll have, because we actually moved a little fast in the
Okay.
because we
Okay. Well, I'm completely honored to be part of this group. I am thrilled on an occasion to bring such a talented group of scholars together from different fields, different generations. Elisheva's work, we've known each other a lot, we go way back. And I've had the pleasure recently, as I've turned to Colonial and Colonial Caribbean and subscribing to slavery and abolition, this is how you get into it in the field, of reading Natasha, like this very interesting work on women uprising, and guess what? They're dressed as men. And Claudia and I should have known each other. Maybe we were men at anthropology meetings before, but through Renato Rosaldo, who was one of my closest friends and collaborators, we were part of a book together. When I first turned to anthropology, Matthew, you were talking about being interdisciplinary. Well, anthropology was a rescue for me at one point, so we might across. And I of course have this particular link. Looking forward to reading your work, your work very much, Matthew. But we of course have a link through my husband being a mathematician. I think he should be here and reading their new work on these the people who are working on contemporary statistics and so forth. I'll just add I don't know how this fits into a couple of themes I have, but one of the first things I ever wrote when I was a graduate student and not finishing up the work that went into society and culture was a book, a long article called Commercial Arithmetics on the Business Life. And I was going to talk a little bit in a moment about how come we do topics. I'll come back to that, but I'll say that here, it was partly because I was married to Chan, and I thought, I better learn something about it. And we were living in New York at the time, and Columbia had a very, very great collection of early mathematical books and books on the history of accounting. And many of them were published in Lyon, which was the town I was writing about. And so in connection with that, I began to look at these very, very interesting books on commercial arithmetic, which were on a subject which, in terms of church teaching, was supposed to be kind of usurious, wrong. So I thought, well, I'll look at these books to see what they have to say about this topic that, in some sense, is condemned because they talk about usury, they talk about compound, they don't use the word. So just to mention that as I've been hearing people talk, I think that there have been, in their own work and in mine, certain kinds of common themes. One is stage theory, or its alternatives. That is, why we might have questions about stage. And I'm hearing everybody's work at alternates, that is, structure and agency, rather than stages. So I thought I would just say a couple words about that and maybe ask you some questions. In my own case, I was reading, Cloudy, you were reading in that course, Edward P. Thompson, and others, and Foucault. And my confrontation with that, having had as an undergraduate, especially a great interest in Marxism, my confrontation with that did have to do with, initially, the writing of Hobsbawm and Roudet, and even Edward, whose work I admired, he began to moderate that as Edward was changing, in regard to stage theory and this teleological approach. And Natasha, this is so long ago, but thinking of stages and progress, whether you, history, the notion that history could be one damn thing after another, which is one of the phrases that we turned against. But the alternative, when I started, was one or another version of stage theory, whether it was a Marxist version or a Western industrialized version. And it was because I was trying to work on the equivalent, say, of the artisans that you were talking about, or when I began to work on women, but even before that, that I couldn't deal with the material. I couldn't make sense of it contextually if I kept held on to the notion that this had to be pre-modern or pre-industrial or as archaic. I couldn't read it. And this just comes up in my own work repeatedly. Just to start with this recent example, that when I wanted to look at slaves' experience of criminal justice, I thought, well, let's start out by looking at what memories they brought over at crime detection and punishment from Africa. And they are a version they are what Western medievalists would call a version of medieval ordeals, some of which are still practiced. And in order to see how they worked and were reworked in Suriname, I had to confront a European tradition which would see this as what it was described as superstitious, not working. In fact, if you actually looked at it and compared it to the system of torture and confession that was current in Suriname at the time, it works just about as well. I mean, bad or better or worse. If you look at it, so that the stage theory simply made it impossible to deal with either structure or agency along the way. So it seems to me that as I think of everybody's work here, that you all probably had, you didn't maybe have to face this, but you might have, I mean, clearly in the history of science,
Absolutely.
that was just, I mean, when I started, believe it or not, I actually had a minor, the first one ever at the University of Michigan, which has now got a great department. I actually did a minor in the history of science at the University of Michigan, and it was either maternalist, very strictly, or it was a social history of progress. So I think we've had, each of us has had, and in Jewish history, I mean, you can still see some of this, that nothing positive could happen until you had, from some people's point of view, until you had the 18th and 19th century Enlightenment. So Jews weren't writing history. This is when Shoutouts changed. They weren't doing autobiographies until the 19th century, and all that writing that we sometimes somehow saw that was autobiographical wasn't really autobiographical. So as I say, I think this is something that in all of our fields, as I say, Natasha's come into it later. But with agency, so I think that we've turned one or another way to agency. Let's use agency, let's use structure for a short way of talking. And I have just a couple of things to raise on this. You used the term, Claudio, at one point about your return comrade, whose last name I didn't get because he sounds fascinating. That his generation had a mixed recognized process, which continued to shape. And in talking about your work with your own work with archives and with sources, and connecting it with my fiction in the archives, you talked about both seeing evidence in the text, but also looking for it as against the grain. And I wanted to just pick up on this idea of against the grain and misrecognized as an interesting, in the talk I gave last night about this linguist, this Jewish-Romanian linguist who works on Yiddish, Romanian, and French. One of the issues that came up in his very complicated life was, a very creative life, was the extent to which he didn't fully recognize what he was doing. And one of the questions I have about my own work is this, that even though, in thinking about agency, I'm not a rational interest person, and look at all kinds of cultural things, all kinds of loyalties that might affect choices, the question of the misrecognized, or of doing, which is partly what's behind against the grain, is perhaps something that we might want to think about. Christopher Clark has just written this book about World War I. Maybe some of you read it. It's called The Sleepwalkers. And it was just reviewed recently, and people have taken issue somewhat with his notion of focusing so much on the great leaders of World War I. But the sleepwalkers, he's done a huge amount of research, is another example of not knowing, not being fully aware in the agency of your action. You might connect it with the unrecognized, unexpected consequences of purpose of social action, to use that old phrase. But it's a little bit more complex than that. And it's not sort of saying false consciousness in the Marxist way. It's not sort of saying they should have known better or they had a class. It's just recognizing the complexity in somebody used to talk about the multi-causal, the complexity that comes about when we look at, as I think we must, agency and its relationship to structures. So I think I just wondered if anybody had any further comment. I know, Claudia, you said that this is part of some of your recent book. The further question, though, that I would still stick by is, and I could exemplify it by just those pardon tales, that model, that there's a document in which legal formulae are required, in which certain things must be said if you want to get a pardon, quite apart from what the quote really happened. And yet, I still see agency, because I still see something to look at in that. And in this case, fighting against reductionism. And I think that this is true of your work, and that it's important to hold on to both elements and look at this. Even looking at the structure as something creative and interesting in itself that is detached from human agency. It's just created in another way. So that was one thing. The other has to do with how we get to topics. And Claudia, you said to begin with that you worked on topics, and then suddenly you happened to read me. I'm sure there are others that you read, and you thought, hey, I thought I was doing this all by myself, or just me and my fellow anthropologists, and sure enough, others were looking at it. I bet we've all sometimes had that topic. And I wanted to ask you, make a comment and ask you a question. The question really has to do with ways in which the context, what's happening in a period. We can even go back to the notion of structure as a short version for that. In some sense, speaks to us. It doesn't mean we have the same views on something, that we come down the same way, but that we experience certain things that bring us within a rough period of here I'm thinking of a short generation to start addressing these topics. Some of you have heard me give an example of this, since you mentioned Edward P. Thompson. When I wrote a paper that's in that book called The Reasons of Misrule about charivaris. Maybe some of you have heard this, the young ones will hear it again. I said that initially it appeared in that book, but a couple of years before it had appeared in Past and Present. So I sent it to Past and Present, and I guess they gave it to Edward, because he was working on he was working on
rough music.
Rough music, yes, and rough music is the English term, but there's also a wife something, but wife sales too, but it's connected with rough music. And he read this paper, I guess they'd been published it, so he liked it, and he wrote me back and he said, I think this is quite extraordinary, that you and I had never met him, I read it, we are both working on the same particular ritual form. We interpreted it differently. I characteristically saw an upbeat side to it. We saw it as really constricted, but that's okay. But when you think about it, there we were, both kind of different versions of the independent left, both involved in the politics of the time. This is 68. Natasha, we were having all kinds of world upside down articles. So it's partly that I'm thinking of that experience. I wrote it and I said, I think it isn't, there's something, so that's one aspect of it. There's also, I sometimes think too, and I'm coming now back to the unexpected in the individual life, and maybe this is another example of structure and personal agency. But sometimes your own narrative, and it's fun to think of everybody's, is accidental. The example since you had again mentioned fiction in the archives, I got, there's always clearly some kinds of big issues that I had in mind. But I'll give two examples, one from my talk last night. One is, I reviewed Lewaladery's Montaigne, which people are still reading that, right? This wonderful book. Some people are still reading it. It's a wonderful book, which is based on the Inquisition interviews with peasants, with heretical peasants in the town of Montaigne. And he used these documents very, very richly to create an ethnographic, an ethnographic view of this village of kinship and structures, things that people were not particularly talking about, not that many about kinship, even doing a little bit of family, Arias's way. It was a very, very good book. But he did not. Well, I went and looked up the Inquisition records, just because I thought it would be fun to see these sources. And the one thing he didn't do in that really splendid book was really talk about how those Inquisition records were created, because they were spoken in Languedoc, and then they were translated into medieval Latin, and then read back to the peasants who had done it in their own tongue. So I took seriously those documents. But when I started reading them, I noticed that they said, a peasant would ask some question about some heretical pastor who would come to preach. They would say, well, 26 years ago I was walking across the village square carrying a sheepskin in one hand and a bag of food in the other, and I saw from a distance this. They liked good stories. This is what these documents were like. And that was what gave me the idea. Because I had known those texts, I had used them for social history purposes, those pardon texts, and I thought, well, now that's interesting. In addition to all the other things that he says about Montaigu, you've got these peasants telling these stories, because we knew they had been read back to them and they were supposed to be. So that was the kind of accident. And I'll just give the other example, what I said last night, that I got involved in this Yiddish, Romanian Shenyanu, because I always knew him as Lazar Senion, who any Sesiamese in this room will know, because he wrote in the early 16th century, the 20th century, the best book about then, it's been surpassed now, but still useful, about language. And I thought, and I was reading this book because I was looking at Wendell. I thought I better learn about Yiddish. And there's this article about Lazar Senion's contribution to Yiddish. And I thought, what? He wrote about Yiddish, and he's not even French, he's Romanian, and he wrote about Romanian. So it was a kind of accidental. And I wonder if is some way in which each of us have accidental narratives that take us to a topic, but that in some sense also there is some ways in which our time, we have our own little individual stories, but our time brings us to topics, if not to all of us simultaneously, then at least to groups of us, that there's a way in which we have our antennae up. So those would be the two kinds of things I'd be very interested to hear your reactions